It wasn't the kind of night you'd expect to blow your world apart. Looking back now, that's what hits me the hardest. Chaos rarely announces itself. No ominous music. No flashing neon signs. Just ordinary moments that spiral into something far darker. That evening started off as perfect as they come. Sandra and I were at Donovan's, a little bar that felt more like a second home. The kind of place with mismatched chairs, a jukebox that never worked quite right, and a bartender who remembered your drink after your second visit. We'd been going there since college, and even though we weren't kids anymore, the charm of the place hadn't worn off. Our group was the usual crowd, a mix of old friends, people we'd shared cheap beer and big dreams with in our 20s, and a few newer faces Sandra had picked up at work. Donovan's wasn't the kind of place that changed much, and neither did our gatherings. The music hummed softly in the background, conversations ebbed and flowed, and laughter bubbled over the hum of the room. Sandra was in her element. She always was in places like that. Some people just have a way of commanding attention without trying, and Sandra was one of them. She wasn't loud or overbearing. She didn't need to be. There was something about the way she carried herself, the way she threw her head back when she laughed, or how her eyes sparkled when she was deep in conversation. She had a kind of magnetism that drew people to her, like moths to a flame. I remember nursing a beer, leaning back in my chair, and watching her talk with Claire, her best friend since college. Claire was saying something, probably one of her sarcastic quips, because Sandra was laughing that laugh that made the whole room feel lighter. For a moment, I just sat there, soaking it in. That's when I noticed Raymond. I'd met him a handful of times before. He was one of Sandra's newer co-workers. The kind of guy who seemed perfectly nice on the surface, polite, friendly, maybe a little too polished. But there was something about him I couldn't quite put my finger on. He wasn't doing anything overtly suspicious, just standing a little too close, leaning a little too far into the conversation. His posture was relaxed, casual, but there was an edge to it, a comfort that felt misplaced. I brushed it off at first. Sandra had always been outgoing, the type to laugh a little too loudly and talk a little too freely, and I didn't want to be that guy. You know, the one who reads too much into every glance, every gesture. But still, something didn't sit right. It's funny how your mind works in moments like that. You start noticing things you wouldn't have paid attention to otherwise. The way his eyes lingered a little too long when she laughed. The way she tilted her head toward him, her hair brushing against his shoulder. Little things, meaningless on their own but together. They whispered something I wasn't ready to hear. I told myself I was imagining it. Sandra wasn't the kind of person who crossed lines. Sure, she was warm and charming, but that was just who she was. She had a light about her, a way of making everyone feel seen and heard. That was part of why I fell in love with her in the first place. So, I shook it off, turned my attention back to my beer, and let the conversation flow around me. It's almost laughable now, how hard I worked to convince myself everything was fine. There's a kind of bliss in denial, isn't there? A comfort in the idea that the life you've built is unshakable, that the person you've chosen to share it with wouldn't dare do anything to break it. But denial doesn't change reality. It just delays it. At the time, I didn't know that night was going to mark the beginning of the end. I didn't know that Raymond's too familiar posture and Sandra's easy laughter were the first cracks in the foundation of our marriage. If I had, I might have done something. Or maybe I wouldn't have. Maybe I would have still sat there, sipping my beer, and telling myself everything was fine because the alternative was too terrifying to consider. That's the thing about hindsight. It's merciless. It forces you to confront the moments when you could have changed the course of your life and didn't. But in that moment, sitting at Donovan's, surrounded by friends, in the comforting hum of normalcy, I didn't know. Not yet. Looking back, it wasn't just their chairs being empty that rattled me. It was the silence that followed. The kind that sneaks up on you, whispering that something isn't right even when you don't have proof. It started innocently enough. Claire had asked me to grab her drink from the bar while she ran to the restroom. Simple. Routine. I liked Claire, and in moments like that, I felt like her co-conspirator in keeping the night running smoothly. But when I came back to the table, everything felt off. Their chairs were empty, Sandra's and Raymond's. At first, I didn't think much of it. People step outside for air, or to take a call. Maybe Raymond had some work thing to handle. Sandra could have gone to check her makeup or dragged Claire along for a bathroom chat. Normal things. But Claire wasn't with her, and nobody seemed to know where they'd gone. I glanced around the table. Tom was still there, poking at the label on his beer bottle. Claire's seat was still empty, and so were Sandra's and Raymond's. The others were locked in a debate about the best decade for rock music, oblivious to anything else. I tried to play it casual. Hey, did Sandra say anything about stepping out? I asked Tom, leaning a little closer so the others wouldn't overhear. Tom hesitated. That's what got me. It wasn't his words. It was the way his shoulders stiffened, the way he shifted awkwardly in his chair, as if he didn't want to look me in the eye. She mentioned needing some fresh air, he said finally, his voice just a little too forced. Raymond went outside to take a call, I think. Maybe they're both out there? He wasn't lying, not exactly, but his tone carried something else, discomfort, maybe even guilt, like he knew something he didn't want to share. My stomach tightened. I don't know why. There wasn't anything explicitly wrong yet. People step outside. People take calls. People need air. But the idea of them, Sandra and Raymond, both stepping out at the same time without a word, it didn't sit right. I'll check, I said, forcing a casual nod, though my throat felt dry. The crisp night air hit me like a slap when I stepped outside. The patio was mostly empty. Just a couple huddled near one of the outdoor heaters, their conversation muted and private. No Sandra. No Raymond. I told myself not to panic. Maybe they'd gone out front. Maybe Raymond really had stepped out for a call and Sandra, being her usual friendly self, had wandered out to chat while he paced around. But as I circled the parking lot, scanning between cars and peering into the dimly lit corners of the lot, that gnawing feeling in my chest grew sharper. There was no sign of them. No hint of Sandra's familiar laugh or Raymond's polished presence. Nothing. I felt ridiculous, walking around the lot like some kind of paranoid fool. I even caught myself glancing at the ground, as if I'd find some clue, some trail of breadcrumbs leading me to her. But there was nothing, just the sound of my own footsteps echoing back at me. And then my phone buzzed. Her name flashed on the screen, Sandra. Hey babe, she said when I answered. Her voice was light, detached, like this was just any other night. Are you okay? I asked, my voice tight with forced calm. You know I care about you, don't you? She said, her tone infuriatingly soft, almost condescending. Care about me? That was her opener? Not where are you? Not I'll be right back, but care about me. It was such an odd thing to say, so out of place. Where the hell are you? I demanded, my frustration slipping through despite my effort to keep it together. Relax, Mike, she replied, her voice tinged with amusement. I just needed a breather. Raymond was out here too, and we started chatting. It's no big deal. No big deal. A breather. With Raymond. The words hit like a punch to the gut. Before I could respond, she cut me off. I'll be back inside in a minute. Don't be dramatic, okay? And then she hung up. I stood there, phone still pressed to my ear, as if I could will her voice back onto the line. The cold bit through my jacket, and for the first time in our relationship, I didn't feel like I was talking to Sandra, my wife, my partner, the woman I thought I knew inside and out. No, the person on the other end of that call felt like a stranger. Someone who was playing a role and doing a terrible job of hiding it. I stayed outside a little longer, staring at the darkened sky and trying to convince myself that this was nothing. People step outside. People chat. It doesn't mean anything. But it wasn't just the act of disappearing. It was the way she spoke to me, the way she brushed me off like I was overreacting, like I was the one making this into something it wasn't. When I finally walked back inside, my stomach was in knots. Sandra returned about 10 minutes later, smiling like nothing had happened. Raymond trailed behind her, his hands stuffed in his pockets, his eyes darting around like a guilty kid caught sneaking candy. And that's when I knew. I didn't have proof, not yet, but I knew. Something wasn't right, and whatever it was, I wasn't going to ignore it anymore. She walked back into the bar like nothing had happened. 10 minutes had passed since that infuriating phone call, and here she was, wearing that same bright smile, as if the last quarter of an hour had been perfectly normal, as if she hadn't left me outside, wandering around like an idiot, piecing together her flimsy excuses. Raymond was right behind her, hands stuffed in his pockets, head lowered, his steps hesitant, like he'd just walked into a room he wasn't supposed to be in. He didn't look at me. He barely looked at anyone. The contrast between their demeanors was striking. Sandra, casual and confident, acted like this was another routine night. Raymond, jittery and out of place, looked ready to bolt at the slightest provocation. Sandra slid into her chair beside me, tossing her coat over the backrest with a nonchalance that made my blood boil. "Did you cool off?" she asked, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Cool off?" I stared at her, my beer untouched on the table. The others around us were quiet now. Claire had returned from the restroom and was sipping her drink with a pointed focus, avoiding eye contact with me. Tom was still there, his attention fixed on the salt shaker as if it held the answers to the universe. No one said anything. No one acknowledged the shift in the atmosphere. "Where were you?" I asked, my voice low but firm. She tilted her head slightly, that practiced gesture she used whenever she wanted to make me feel like I was overreacting. "I told you, Mike," she said, her tone annoyingly patient. "I needed some air." Raymond was already outside, and we talked. That's all. Talked about what? I pressed, keeping my voice calm even though my chest felt like it was on fire. "Work stuff," she said with a shrug, as if that was enough to explain everything. Raymond, who had been shifting uncomfortably in his seat, muttered something about needing another drink and disappeared toward the bar. "Coward. Work stuff?" I repeated, my voice growing louder now. Heads turned slightly at nearby tables, subtle movements from people pretending not to listen. "You just disappeared, Sandra. No heads up. No text. You left me sitting here like an idiot." Her smile faded, replaced by a sharp glare. "Don't be dramatic, Mike," she said, her tone cutting. "I didn't think you'd care. You were busy talking to Tom. I didn't think I needed to check in with you every 5 minutes." The weight of her words landed hard. She was trying to make this my fault, to paint me as possessive, as unreasonable. I felt the eyes of our friends on me, their silence pressing down like a spotlight, amplifying the humiliation. I leaned in closer, lowering my voice so only she could hear me. "You're lying." Her eyes widened briefly before narrowing into a cold, dangerous stare. "Excuse me," she hissed. "You heard me," I said, my voice steady. "You're lying, Sandra. I can feel it. I don't know what you're trying to pull, but I'm not stupid." For a brief moment, the mask slipped. Her expression hardened, her jaw tightening like she was about to explode. But then, just as quickly, the smile was back. This time, it was colder, sharper, a weapon instead of a shield. "You're being paranoid," she said, standing abruptly. Her chair scraped against the floor, drawing more attention from the room. "If you can't trust me, that's on you, Mike. I'm done with this conversation." Without waiting for my response, she grabbed her coat and turned to Claire. "Coming." Claire hesitated, glancing at me for a brief moment, an apology flickering in her eyes, before grabbing her purse and following Sandra out the door. Just like that, she was gone again. The silence at the table was suffocating. Tom cleared his throat awkwardly, finally breaking the tension. "Hey man," he said quietly, "maybe you should head home. You don't look so good." I nodded, though I barely heard him. My mind was spinning, my chest tight with anger and confusion. The woman I thought I knew inside and out had just turned into someone I couldn't recognize. A stranger who had no problem lying to my face, gaslighting me in front of our friends, and walking away without a second thought. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It wasn't some minor miscommunication. It was calculated, deliberate, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing on the edge of something huge, something that was about to shatter everything I thought I knew about my life. I didn't go straight home after the bar. I couldn't. My mind was a storm of anger, confusion, and something I hated to admit, fear. Fear of what I might find if I let myself dig deeper. Instead, I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The streetlights outside Donovan's flickered in and out of focus, casting long shadows that danced on the pavement. My chest felt tight, the anger bubbling beneath the surface, but it wasn't just anger anymore. It was something darker. Doubt. Sandra's behavior that night wasn't an isolated incident. Little things had been piling up for weeks. Late nights at work, sudden gym sessions she never used to bother with, a new perfume she claimed she just liked the smell of. I'd brushed it all aside, telling myself it was nothing. We all go through phases, right? But tonight, she crossed a line. When I finally drove home, the house felt emptier than usual. Her car wasn't in the driveway. I didn't even bother calling her. I already knew she wouldn't answer. Instead, I went inside, grabbed a beer from the fridge, and sat in the dark living room, replaying every detail of the night in my mind. Her laughter with Raymond, her dismissive tone on the phone, the way she brushed off my questions like they were an inconvenience. It was like trying to solve a puzzle where half the pieces were missing. No matter how hard I tried to make sense of it, the picture wouldn't come together. And then I saw it. Her laptop. It was sitting on the kitchen counter, half closed, like she'd been using it earlier. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity. Normally, I wouldn't even consider it. Sandra and I had always respected each other's privacy. But this wasn't a normal situation. I stood up, my beer forgotten on the coffee table, and walked over to the counter. My hands hovered over the laptop, guilt flickering in my chest. What if I was wrong? What if I found nothing? But then I remembered her tone on the phone. That dismissive, almost smug tone. I opened the laptop. It was locked, of course, but Sandra wasn't exactly a fortress of secrecy. Her password hadn't changed in years. Milo, the name of our dog, followed by the year we got married. My fingers moved almost on autopilot, typing it in. The screen unlocked. Her browser history was the first thing I checked. It was clean. Too clean. No social media, no shopping sites, not even a search for recipes or news. It was as if she'd wiped it recently. Suspicious, I moved to her email. At first, there was nothing unusual. Bills, promotions, reminders about events. But then I saw it. Raymond. His name sat there, staring back at me, bold and undeniable. The subject line was innocuous enough. Quick question. But the timestamp made my stomach drop. It had been sent just 2 hours before we went to the bar. I clicked it, my heart pounding in my chest. The email wasn't long, but it was damning. Can't stop thinking about last night. When can we do it again? Let me know if you're free after drinks tonight. Last night. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My mind raced, connecting dots I hadn't even realized were there. The work emergencies, the late-night gym sessions, the sudden perfume. It all made sense now. I scrolled up, my fingers trembling, and found a chain of emails between them. They weren't explicit, but the tone was clear. Inside jokes, compliments, casual references to meetups I'd never heard about. It wasn't just a hunch anymore. It was real. She was cheating on me. I slammed the laptop shut, the sound echoing in the empty kitchen. My chest heaved as I stared at the dark screen, my reflection glaring back at me. What do you do in a moment like that? Call her? Demand answers? Throw the laptop across the room and hope the sound drowns out the pounding in your head? My phone buzzed, breaking the silence. I glanced at the screen. It was a text. From Sandra. Staying at Claire's tonight. Don't wait up. Love you. Love me. I almost laughed. The audacity of it. She'd left the bar with Raymond, lied to my face, and now she had the nerve to send me a text dripping with fake affection? I didn't reply. Instead, I sat there, simmering in my own thoughts, knowing I couldn't let this slide. Sandra had made her move, and now it was my turn. When I pulled up to Raymond's apartment complex, the sight of her car sitting casually in the lot hit me harder than I expected. It was parked there like this was normal. Like she belonged here. As if every lie she told, every excuse she made, hadn't led her to this moment. For a brief second, I hesitated. I gripped the steering wheel so tight my fingers ached, staring at that car as if it could give me the answers I was too afraid to find. A part of me wanted to turn around, to go home and pretend this wasn't happening. But I couldn't. Not after everything I'd seen. Not after that email. My hands were shaking as I stepped out of the car, but I didn't let myself think about it. I slammed the door shut, the sound echoing in the quiet parking lot. Every step toward his apartment felt like a march to war. I didn't have a plan. What was I going to say? What was I going to do? I didn't know, but the thought of sitting in that house for one more second, stewing in my own anger and humiliation, was unbearable. I reached his door and knocked harder than I intended, the sound reverberating down the hallway. For a moment, there was silence. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, loud and insistent. And then the door opened. There he was, Raymond. He froze in the doorway, his eyes wide, his face pale. He looked like a kid caught sneaking out of class, guilty, nervous, and utterly unprepared. "Mike," he stammered, his voice shaky. What are you doing here?" What was I doing here? The question was so absurd it almost made me laugh. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The look on his face said it all. Behind him, I could see Sandra standing in the living room. She wasn't wearing her usual clothes. No, she was in an oversized shirt that wasn't hers. One of his, I assumed. She was barefoot, her hair slightly tousled, and she looked so damn comfortable it made my blood boil. "Move," I said, my voice low and firm. Raymond hesitated, his hand still on the doorknob as if he thought he could stop me. "Move," I repeated, my voice louder this time. He stepped aside. He didn't have a choice. I walked into the apartment, ignoring his protests, and stopped in front of Sandra. She didn't flinch. She didn't look embarrassed or ashamed. No, she crossed her arms over her chest, her chin tilted up in defiance. "What are you doing here, Mike?" she asked, her tone sharp and accusatory, as if I were the one in the wrong. I laughed bitterly. "You're really going to stand there and act like I'm the one out of line? After everything?" Raymond hovered near the door, his presence infuriating but irrelevant. This wasn't about him. Not really. Sandra rolled her eyes, a gesture so dismissive it made my fists clench at my sides. "This is ridiculous," she said. "You shouldn't have come here." "I shouldn't have come here?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You've been sneaking around with this clown, lying to my face, and I'm the one out of line?" "Lower your voice," she hissed, glancing toward the windows like she was suddenly worried about what the neighbors might think. "Oh, now you're worried about appearances?" I snapped. "Maybe you should have thought about that before you started acting like a complete stranger." Raymond finally found his voice, stepping forward with his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Look, Mike, I know this isn't ideal, but—" "Shut up," I said, cutting him off without even looking at him. "This isn't your conversation. Sit down, or I'll make you sit down." He backed off immediately, retreating to the couch like a scolded child. I turned my attention back to Sandra. "How long?" I asked, my voice calm now, dangerously calm. "What?" she asked, feigning ignorance. "Don't play dumb with me, Sandra," I said. "How long has this been going on? Weeks? Months? Longer?" She hesitated. Her eyes darted toward Raymond, as if looking for backup, but he stayed silent, his head down. "Answer me," I demanded, taking a step closer. "Fine," she snapped. "A few months. Are you happy now? Does knowing the timeline make you feel better?" "Better?" I repeated, a bitter laugh escaping my throat. "You think this is about me feeling better? This is about you destroying our marriage and then having the audacity to blame me for it." "Our marriage was over long before Raymond," she said, her voice cold. "You just didn't want to admit it. I've been unhappy for years, Mike. Years. But you were too busy playing the perfect husband to notice." Her words hit like a slap, but I refused to let her see the sting. "And instead of talking to me, you decided to crawl into Raymond's arms?" I asked, my voice shaking with controlled rage. "That's your solution?" She shrugged, her face unrepentant. "You wouldn't have listened. You never do." I stared at her, my chest heaving. "Do you even feel bad about this?" For a moment, something flickered across her face. Regret, guilt, something. But it was gone just as quickly as it appeared. "I feel bad that you found out this way," she said, her voice flat. "But I don't regret finding something that makes me happy." Her words hit harder than any punch. She didn't regret it. She didn't care. I nodded slowly, the anger giving way to something colder. "You know what, Sandra? You're right. Our marriage is over. But not for the reasons you think. It's over because you're selfish, cruel, and incapable of taking responsibility for your actions. I turned toward Raymond, who was still cowering on the couch. Good luck with her, man. You're going to need it. Without waiting for a response, I walked out the door, slamming it behind me. The sound echoed in the hallway, but it wasn't enough to drown out the sound of my heart breaking. After I slammed the door to Raymond's apartment, I didn't go straight home. I couldn't. The walls of my house already felt like they were caving in, suffocating me with memories of Sandra, the woman I thought I knew, the woman I thought I could trust. Instead, I drove aimlessly. The city blurred past me, streetlights smearing into long trails of light as I tried to process everything that had just happened. Her words kept replaying in my head, like a cruel loop I couldn't escape. Our marriage was over long before Raymond. I've been unhappy for years. I don't regret finding something that makes me happy. Each sentence was a dagger, and the deeper they cut, the more I realized that the life I thought I had wasn't real. I was holding onto a fantasy, a picture-perfect version of my marriage that didn't exist anymore. Maybe never did. Eventually, I ended up at a park. Not just any park, the park. The one where Sandra and I had our first date. It was quiet now, the kind of stillness that presses down on you, making every sound seem louder. The swings creaked faintly in the breeze, and the distant hum of traffic felt like it came from another world. I parked the car and got out, the cold night air biting at my skin. It didn't matter. I needed to feel something, anything, other than the numbness creeping in. I sat on one of the benches, staring at the empty playground. My mind flickered back to that first date. I'd brought her here after dinner, and we'd laughed like teenagers while swinging next to each other, pretending we could touch the stars. I remember thinking that night that I'd found her. The one. How naive I was. I pulled out my phone, almost out of habit, and started scrolling through old messages. Texts from months ago, when we still called each other silly pet names, when she'd send me photos of random things she thought would make me laugh. Back then, I thought we were happy. But now? Looking at those messages felt like reading a story written by someone else. Someone who didn't know how it would end. I wanted to cry, to scream, to do something. But the tears wouldn't come, and the screaming felt pointless. So, I just sat there, letting the cold seep into my bones. At some point, I started to wonder, how long had she been planning this? Had she already checked out of our marriage while I was still holding on, clueless? Were there signs I missed? Moments where I could have stopped this from happening? The questions were endless, and the answers were nowhere to be found. I stayed at that park for hours, replaying every argument, every cold shoulder, every moment that didn't quite feel right in the last few months. It was like piecing together a puzzle where the picture didn't make sense, no matter how hard I tried. When I finally went home, it was nearly morning. The house was dark, eerily quiet. Her car wasn't in the driveway. I didn't expect it to be. I stepped inside, and the silence hit me like a physical force. It wasn't just the absence of noise. It was the absence of her. The way she used to hum while making coffee. The way her keys would jangle when she walked in the door. The way she'd leave her shoes in the middle of the hallway, no matter how many times I asked her not to. I stood there, in the middle of the living room, and for the first time, it really hit me. This wasn't just a fight. This wasn't just a bump in the road. This was the end. The anger I'd felt earlier was gone now, replaced by something heavier. Grief. Not just for Sandra, but for the life we'd built together. For the memories that were now tainted. For the future that no longer existed. I walked to the kitchen and grabbed a beer from the fridge, not bothering to turn on the lights. I sat at the table, staring at nothing, the events of the night replaying in my mind like a broken record. Her defiance, her indifference, her refusal to even pretend she felt bad about what she'd done. That was the hardest part. She didn't regret it. She didn't care. And that realization crushed me. I spent the rest of the night in that chair, trying to make sense of a situation that didn't make sense. How do you go from being someone's everything to being a convenient lie? How do you reconcile the person you thought you knew with the stranger who stared back at you with cold, unapologetic eyes? I didn't have the answers. All I knew was that the life I thought I had was gone, and the woman I thought I loved had been a stranger all along. When the sun finally started to rise, casting its pale light across the empty kitchen, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't hope. Not yet. But it was determination. Sandra had made her choices. Now it was time for me to make mine. When the sun rose the next morning, it brought no comfort. The pale light spilling through the kitchen window only emphasized how empty the house felt. I'd spent the entire night in that chair, staring at the table, my thoughts a hurricane of anger, sadness, and disbelief. But as the hours ticked by, something else began to take hold, a quiet, burning determination. I couldn't let this be my life. I couldn't let her lies, her betrayal, define me. The first step was practical. I grabbed my phone and made a call I never thought I'd have to make, to a lawyer. Just saying the word divorce out loud made my stomach churn, but it also felt real, necessary. The lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Karen, was kind but direct. She didn't sugarcoat anything, and I appreciated that. This isn't just about ending a marriage, she said. It's about protecting yourself and your future. Gather everything, bank statements, property records, anything you think might matter. The cleaner we make this, the quicker it'll be over. Her words hit me hard. Protecting myself, my future. It sounded so clinical, so cold, but it was the truth. I'd been so focused on Sandra, on us, that I'd lost sight of myself somewhere along the way. I spent the next few days doing exactly what Karen suggested. I went through every drawer, every file, collecting anything that might be relevant. Our joint bank accounts, the mortgage, insurance policies. It felt strange, almost invasive, like I was picking apart the skeleton of our life together. But it also felt empowering. For the first time in weeks, months, maybe, I was taking control. The next step was harder. Telling my family and friends. I started with my parents. Sitting across from them in their cozy living room, I felt like a kid again, confessing that I'd broken a window playing baseball. Except this wasn't a window. It was my marriage. My mom, ever the optimist, reached across the coffee table to squeeze my hand. "Maybe this is a blessing in disguise, Mike," she said gently. "You deserve someone who respects you." For once, I didn't roll my eyes at her cliché. She was right. My dad was quieter, his expression unreadable. Finally, he said, "What do you need from us?" That question, so simple, yet so profound, was enough to make my throat tighten. I didn't know what I needed. I just knew I didn't want to go through it alone. My friends were a mixed bag. Some were shocked, others angry on my behalf. Tom, who'd been at the bar that night, admitted he'd suspected something was off for a while but hadn't known how to bring it up. That stung, but I couldn't blame him. The hardest part, though, was facing myself. One night, about a week after everything came crashing down, I found myself sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at an old photo of Sandra and me. We looked so happy, so full of hope. I wanted to reach into that photo and shake the man I used to be, warn him about what was coming. But as I stared at it, a different thought struck me. I wasn't that guy anymore. This experience, her betrayal, had stripped me down to my core. It hurt like hell, but it also gave me clarity. I'd spent so much time trying to fix a marriage that Sandra had already abandoned, ignoring my own needs and worth in the process. That had to stop. I started going to the gym again, not because Sandra always said I should, but because I wanted to feel strong, to take control of my body and my life. I reconnected with friends I drifted away from, filling my nights with laughter and distractions that didn't involve overanalyzing Sandra's lies. One day, on a whim, I signed up for a cooking class. It was something I'd always wanted to do but never found the time for. I burned the first dish so badly the instructor jokingly asked if I was trying to sabotage the class, but by the end of the session, I was smiling. A real, genuine smile. Sandra tried to reach out during this time. Calls, texts, even a handwritten letter she left in the mailbox. I didn't respond. Not because I hated her, I didn't, but because I realized I didn't need anything from her anymore. No explanations. No apologies. No closure. Closure, I discovered, doesn't come from the person who hurt you. It comes from deciding they no longer get to control your story. By the time the divorce papers were ready to be signed, I felt stronger than I had in months. The process wasn't dramatic or drawn out. Just signatures on paper. When it was done, I walked out of the lawyer's office and stood in the sunlight, feeling like I could finally breathe again. It wasn't the end of the pain, not yet, but it was the beginning of something new, something that was mine. It didn't take long for Sandra to reach out. At first, it was subtle, a text here, a voicemail there. The kind of casual attempts that might make someone believe she was just checking in, but I knew better. Each message carried a hint of something unspoken, a thread she hoped I'd grab onto. The first text came just days after I filed for divorce. "Hey Mike, just wanted to see how you're doing." How I'm doing. That was rich. Coming from the woman who had shattered everything we'd built together, the audacity of it almost made me laugh. I stared at the screen for a long time before locking my phone and setting it down. I didn't reply. The second message came 2 days later. "I miss talking to you." Talking? I thought bitterly. When was the last time we actually talked? Not just exchanged words, but really talked like partners, like people who cared about each other? Months, at least. Maybe longer. I didn't reply to that one either. Her voicemail started next. "Mike, I know you're upset, and you have every right to be. I wish we could talk. Please call me back." Her tone was softer than I remembered, almost pleading, but it didn't move me. Not anymore. The woman leaving those messages wasn't the same person who had lied to my face, dismissed my feelings, and flaunted her betrayal. Or maybe she was, and I was just finally seeing her clearly. Then came the handwritten letter. I found it in the mailbox one morning, nestled between bills and junk mail. The sight of her familiar handwriting on the envelope stirred something in me, a pang of nostalgia, a flicker of the love I used to feel. For a moment, I considered tossing it straight into the trash, but curiosity won out. The letter was short, just a few paragraphs, but every word felt calculated. "Mike, I know I've hurt you, and I don't deserve your forgiveness. But for what it's worth, I never meant for things to end this way. I didn't plan for any of this to happen. I got lost, and I made mistakes. I wish I could take them back, but I can't. All I can do is say I'm sorry. I miss you. I miss us. I know it's too late to fix what's broken, but I hope one day you'll remember the good times and not just the bad. Sandra." I read it twice, searching for something real, an acknowledgement of what she'd done, an honest apology. But all I found was a vague expression of regret, wrapped in empty words that meant nothing to me now. I set the letter on the counter and stared at it for a long time. Part of me wanted to tear it up, to erase her words the way she'd erased our life together. But I didn't. I just left it there, untouched and unanswered. Her attempts didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, she called several more times, leaving voicemails that ranged from apologetic to defensive. "Why won't you talk to me, Mike? I'm trying here. Doesn't that count for something? I know I screwed up, okay? But it's not like you were perfect either. You were so checked out, so wrapped up in your routine, you didn't even notice I was unhappy." Her words stung, but not in the way she probably intended. They stung because they reminded me of how blind I'd been, how much of myself I'd sacrificed for a relationship that had been crumbling long before I realized. I didn't respond to any of her messages, not because I was trying to punish her, but because I realized something important. I didn't need anything from her anymore. I didn't need her apologies or her excuses. I didn't need her to acknowledge my pain or admit her mistakes. I didn't need closure from her, because closure doesn't come from the person who hurt you. It comes from letting go of the hold they have over you. And that's what I did. With every unanswered call, every ignored text, I felt a little lighter. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but slowly, I started to reclaim my life. I poured my energy into things that mattered: my friends, my family, and myself. Sandra's last attempt came a month after the divorce was finalized. Another voicemail, this one quieter, almost resigned. "Mike, it's me. I wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything. I know you're done with me, and I don't blame you. I just hope you're okay. Take care." I didn't listen to it twice. By that point, I had already made my decision. Sandra didn't get to control my story anymore. She'd made her choices, and I'd made mine. I deleted the voicemail and didn't look back. The day of the divorce hearing felt anticlimactic, considering the emotional storm that had led me there. There was no dramatic courtroom scene, no heated exchanges. It was quiet, procedural, and painfully efficient. Just papers to sign, a few formalities to go through, and it was done. Sandra was there, of course. She sat on the other side of the room, glancing at me now and then, but I didn't meet her gaze. I couldn't. The sight of her only reminded me of what we'd lost, and what she'd chosen to destroy. When the judge finalized everything, there was no great wave of relief, no triumphant sense of closure. Just a strange emptiness, like I'd been walking with a heavy load for so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand upright. As I walked out of the courthouse, the sunlight hit me, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. Not deeply, not yet, but enough to realize that this was the first step toward something new, something mine. The days that followed were a blur. The silence in the house was no longer suffocating. It was liberating. Each room that once carried echoes of her now felt like a blank slate. Her belongings were gone, leaving space for me to rebuild my life, piece by piece. At first, it was the little things. Rearranging furniture, donating the things we bought together that no longer felt like mine. Small, symbolic acts that helped me reclaim the space. But it wasn't just the house I had to reclaim. It was myself. I threw myself into activities that had nothing to do with her, nothing to do with us. I kept going to the gym, not out of anger, but because it felt good to take care of myself again. I cooked meals I enjoyed, learned new recipes from the class I'd signed up for, and even burned a few more dishes along the way. I reconnected with friends I hadn't seen in years, filling my nights with laughter that felt real, not forced. We'd talk about everything and nothing, and for a few hours, I'd forget about the past. But healing isn't linear, and there were moments, quiet, solitary moments, when the weight of it all would sneak back in. Sitting alone at the dinner table, flipping through old photos, or finding something as trivial as her handwriting on a leftover grocery list could pull me back into the pain. Yet, with every passing day, those moments grew less frequent, less intense. Sandra tried to reach out one final time. A handwritten note left in my mailbox. She didn't say much, just that she hoped I was okay and wished me happiness. I read it once, folded it neatly, and tucked it into a drawer. It didn't matter anymore. She was no longer part of my story. I learned something during those months. Closure doesn't come from the person who hurt you. It comes from deciding they no longer have power over you. And with that realization, I moved forward. Months later, my life looked nothing like it did before, and that was a good thing. I'd built something new, something entirely mine. The house that once felt like a tomb now felt alive, filled with laughter and warmth from friends who came over to cook or watch games. I started volunteering at a local shelter on weekends, something I'd always said I'd do someday. And I found joy in the small things. An early morning run, a perfectly cooked meal, the way the sunlight streamed through the kitchen window. One day, while cleaning out the closet, I stumbled across an old photo of Sandra and me. For a moment, I just stared at it, expecting the familiar wave of pain to crash over me. But it didn't. Instead, I felt gratitude, not for her, or for what she did, but for what I'd learned through the pain. I discovered my strength, my worth, and the power of moving forward. To anyone who's been where I've been, let me say this: you'll survive this. It won't be easy, and it won't be quick. There will be days when it feels impossible, when the weight of it all seems too much to bear. But one day, you'll wake up, and the pain won't be the first thing you feel. You'll laugh again, dream again, and build a life that makes you proud. Sandra made her choices, and I made mine. I chose to move forward, and for the first time in a long time, I felt free.